All right, so I already have the EQ wedge on here, and that'll have your latitude adjustment knob and your altizimuth adjustment knobs. And you're gonna wonder, what's this pretty little pink wire you got hanging? I bought one of the original Star Adventurers, and it came with just this god awful reticule illuminating contraption that they wanted you to use to. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not even holding this over the camera. So it came with this, horrible. This is your polar scope built into the Star Adventure here, and the original ones, like the one I have here, came with just this awful scope illuminating light. It was completely worthless, and they have since upgraded that to a actually very useful little light. And I helped a person who had recently bought one, and I was like, oh yeah, throw that away because it's just completely useless. And he's like, oh, let's try it. So I put it in, and I'm like, oh wow, this is like way better. So I have on you'll come with this little plate that screws into the bottom of the bracket. Again, this is like been on here for so long, I think it's rusted onto there. But you just slide this into your EQ wedge and tighten that down. So like I said, there's the small bracket. This comes with your Star Adventure. I'm not sure about the iOptron, the newer version. I don't know how that attaches. I know it has a wedge that is like this, that also has, so for the Star Adventure, you release this clutch, and then you can adjust the latitude. So on here are, markings for the actual latitude that you are physically at. Here in Salt Lake, we're close to 40. We're around 40 to 45. These aren't like 100% accurate. Again, they're just crudely glued on there. But it's just a way for you to adjust the vertical angle of your tracking mount. And I know the new the iOptron Sky Guider has something very similar to this. The old iOptron Sky Tracker, this wedge was built onto the body of the tracking mount itself, and it was a very similar thing. It had a latitude adjustment knob, and so you just slide for the Star Adventure. You just slide this. I lock the clutch once I know I've got Polaris sighted. I'm doing this backwards. These are your altizimuth adjustment knobs, and this just takes some practice. On a small mount like this, you don't have a lot of, let's say, freedom. There's only maybe 10 degrees that this will rotate around the center axis of your tripod. And really, you should set up your tripod so you have your forward leg pointing towards Polaris. This forward leg is gonna be a pretty solid weight bearing leg. You're gonna have your counterweight hanging out over it, and so you want that pointed towards Polaris if possible. So like I said, you want to set up your tripod so you're already generally facing Polaris, and then you're going to use these knobs here to kind of fine tune that directionality. Okay, so we have the tracking mount attached to the EQ wedge, and you can leave this clutch loose until you have Polaris perfectly centered in your polar scope, or you can just tighten it down. All right, so now I have this horrible behemoth.
In this process of showing the behemoth, can you explain more about the whys of it?
Yep.
People are curious about that awesome pano head.
So the whys for this will make more sense when I talk a little bit about the imaging workflow. But basically, I can't remember who asked the question earlier, but they had mentioned they were having difficulties aligning a shot with something like an 85 millimeter lens by attaching the camera directly to the declination bracket. the why for attaching this ridiculousness to this has less to do with 85 millimeter and more to do with setting up panoramas with like a 24 to 50 millimeter lens. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. So the declination bracket just slides nicely. For me, this is my polar scope illuminator. I just stick this in here and then slide that. One thing you want to make sure you do, of course, these screws we were talking about earlier are not tight anymore. So the declination bracket has a center, I don't know, you can kind of see it. There's a gap in the middle, and I recommend people buy the Astro package that comes with this declination bracket. If you buy the photography package, it comes with an adapter that blocks the polar scope, which is like, you talk about awesome. Stupid designs. Like, what engineer thought that was a good idea? Anyways, so the declination bracket, you want to slide it in there so the majority of the weight, the majority of your camera weight is going to be closer to the axis, but you don't want to block your polar scope. And that's just going to, that'll depend on your camera lens. It'll depend on your camera body, how big it is. I can't, that's just going to take a little trial and error on your part to find the closest you can get to lowering that bracket down there. Okay, so, and then the last thing is, of course, your counterweight. So if you're still wondering about this stupid pink thing, this is just a little hand controller. I don't know if you can see it on the feed, but...
You can see it's in your hand, but we can't make out any details on it.
Yeah, it's too bright in here to see it. But in the dark, this glows, this pink, it's a fiber optic light wire. It glows nicely. It's not so...
Is it lit right now?
Yeah, it is. Can you see that?
Yeah. It's going to show it in here in a second, but carry on. I can see it well on the other camera. So why does that glow?
It glows so I can illuminate the polar scope. So in your polar scope is a reticule. It looks like a clock. And the reticule is how you polar align, right? So Polaris has to be in a specific position in your reticule. On your mount, you want to loosen this clutch so you can rotate this in the RA axis freely. And once you're able to rotate this, you should look through your scope. And in the case of the Star Adventure, the reticule is like the crosshairs kind of like a gun scope, and then there's a cross through the middle. And really you want that cross to be aligned like a clock. So there's going to be a 0, a 3, a 6, and a 9 position. And you just want that to be, 0 and 6 o'clock to be vertical and 3 and 9 to be horizontal. As you're learning this, once you get really comfortable with polar aligning, you won't even have to worry about it. The clock orientation, again, is just a circle. So the markings on that reticule over time aren't so important as just knowing where you need to put Polaris. And so, I recommend having all of this stuff kind of set up and ready to be polar aligned, and then putting your camera on and then doing the polar alignment. Because if you start by polar aligning and then putting all your gear on, you're going to screw up the polar alignment. All right, and then the last thing here is...
Your question real quick from
camera.
Kurt. Do you ever use the setting dials on the Star Adventurer?
No.
But why not?
So when you get if you use the Star Adventurer and you get these awesome instructions that make quite literally 0 sense, you'll discover that the dials on the back of the polar scope, those are They're only if you have no other way to figure out where Polaris needs to be. And the dials correspond to three things: the date, the time, and your geographical location. And for a lot of people, it'll be really difficult to translate those three things into the dial settings. And so, everybody has a smartphone these days. Forget the dials on the back. The dials just need to be set to essentially zero. So make sure everything is zeroed. And in the instructions, at least for the Star Adventure, are very clear on how to zero the dial. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that because we don't have a lot of time.
Cool. In comparison with the Skywatcher Star Adventure, mini Wi-Fi, good or bad experience with it?
The mini, I would say, is if you have a very light camera and are using a very light lens. This camera setup would not work on the mini. So this has a payload capacity of 11 pounds. If you get into deep sky object imaging, people will tell you you should try to set your limit for how much you put on the tracking mount to half of the payload capacity. So you're limited to maybe 5.5 pounds of actual gear that should be sitting on this. I'm exceeding that probably pretty substantially. I haven't weighed this, but my guess would be that with the geared head and then the pano head on top of that, I'm probably pushing 8 pounds. But that just comes with experience. I've gotten used to having all this stuff on here and how to operate them out. But for people who are just starting, I would definitely just leave it on the declination bracket and use a ball head, because that'll cut your weight substantially. Whereas with the mini mount, I think its payload capacity is 6 pounds.
Wow.
And so if you're, my camera and lens probably way close to that already. But I think it's a great mount if you like backpacking and you have something like a Sony mirrorless, or maybe an Olympus mirrorless, and you're using a very light lens, like a Nifty 50. Those old Nifty 50s, they weigh nothing. So you could easily put something lightweight like that on one of those. And I've heard pretty good things about them, but those are definitely more geared towards people who aren't interested in using these huge honking setups.
So Kirk asks, what app do you like for finding the orientation of Polaris?
So I was talking to Aaron about this earlier, and I took screenshots of the app that I use. I use an Android phone, and if you go into the Play Store, there is an app called Polar Finder. You're probably not going to see this. When I switch to the post-processing segment, I'll pull up the screenshots that I took of this app. It's a great app. It is literally just called Polar Finder. And the app has different settings for the type of mount you use. It has settings for setting your geographic location, your hemisphere. It has a night mode, date, time, all that stuff. And it's a free app. So it's probably the most easy thing to use. The only thing you have to watch out for is make sure you have the mount. So if you go in the app preferences, there'll be a reticle type. You need to put in the right mount you have. So for the Star Adventure, the polar scope it's called mirrored. So the polar scope is mirrored in both the X and Y axis. I think for the iOptron, if I remember correctly, it's mirrored in only one axis, and then some other mounts aren't mirrored at all. And that actually is pretty important. You need to have Polaris at the right hour angle in your reticule. We have my goofy polar illuminating scope light here, and then counterweights attached. For the Star Adventure, there's this is called the RA clutch. Don't crank this down. I think when I first started, and pretty much everybody I've talked to, when they first start doing this stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, it's so important to have everything really, really tightened down. And they just slam this RA clutch down. And you will find that that'll just give you headaches later on, because you'll be all polar aligned and you'll be ready to go. And you're like, actually, I need to adjust this a little bit. And the fine tune controls aren't fast enough. And so I think a lot of people will grab at the RA clutch and they'll realize that they overcrank this thing substantially. And as a result, it'll screw up your polar alignment by just like pushing them out too hard. So the RA clutch, you just want to hand tight it. Once you start feeling it giving you resistance, that's good enough. As long as you're not putting tons of force on the clutch itself, it's not going to move. So what I end up doing, is I kind of have my mount in the direction of Polaris. I know Polaris is in the scope, and I haven't done my polar alignment yet, but it's close enough. I'll hand tight this RA clutch down, and then I'll move and I'll attach my camera. And make sure you have your ball head tightened and anything else that your camera could be attached to. I've heard horror stories of people like putting their camera on and tightening your plate attachment, and then, oh my gosh, it's loose, and they let go and their camera's like, bloop, there goes a couple $1,000s of equipment.
Yes, that would be the worst.
Oh yeah. And so this looks just absolutely ridiculous now, but
at the very top, we have a question pending, and I'll ask it now because it's there. What is it? Is it an intervalometer at the top of your camera?
Oh yeah, I am so sorry. I totally should have explained this. This is my shutter release, and this is a very cheap piece of equipment that is like one of those luxury items that invest in a wireless one. Holy cow, like the wired one is maybe half the price and it's like $20, and the wireless one's like $40. But so if you have the wired one, the wired one is generally just it just hangs, and you want as little stuff hanging off as possible. So if you're like, your camera's over here and it's trying to track, and you got this thing hanging off that's your intervalometer, if the wind catches that, that's going to screw up your tracking. So buy a wireless one that attaches to the hot shoe. Pretty much every camera manufacturer I've ever seen has an Amazon, cheapo one. This has worked great for me. I think this costs like I said, $40, and the batteries last forever. So that is what that is. Yeah, sorry for not explaining that. That is my wireless intervalometer. Plus, when it's 10 below zero and you're like freezing to death and you don't want to take your hands out to like trigger the shutter, wireless is amazing. Okay, so we put the camera on there, and we have basically everything loaded up at this point. The last thing you want to make sure you do is polar align. We talked about the app Polar Finder. It'll make a lot more sense when I can sit down and kind of show you the screenshots. But as long as you have the clock, your reticle in your Polar Finder, oriented as you would see a clock, 0369 or 12369, then it's pretty simple. You just want to look at your app, and in this app's case, as long as you have the right mount set, it just places a little green dot where Polaris needs to be. And make sure you have your time and date set properly. Like, I've used a tablet and the time and date was wrong on the tablet. And I used the app, and Polaris is like way off, and I'm like, why isn't my tracking working like at all? It was like the time and date settings are wrong on your freaking tablet. So. And
is that because you lost internet when you went out there, and so it just didn't update? Yep. Yeah, I've done that.
So we have all this stuff. If you've bought your mount and you don't have this 3-way gear head, don't worry. You'll have this. So this will, your bracket will be attached here. And then on here, you can just put a ball head, and then you'll attach your camera to that. Now, why do I have this ridiculous monstrosity? Okay. So we've polar aligned. You're about to start imaging. One thing you want to do before you image is make sure, don't let this swing freely. You just want to make sure this weight is properly balanced on the mount. And you can see this is like incredibly unbalanced. I let go a little bit and it's just like, it's swinging wildly to the east. So you kind of have to go through a process of, you can either swing this weight down and that'll prevent the mount from rotating. You can also lower your declination bracket. You just got to be really careful when you do all of this. If you make drastic moves, it can screw up your polar alignment, or even worse, risk dropping your camera and whatnot. I'm going to rotate this around, pretend like we're actually imaging. So the Milky Way would be southeast if you're in the northern hemisphere. That's a little bit better. See, I can like let go and it's not like flopping over crazy. And even if it's one thing I haven't mentioned, the way these tracking mounts work is they have it's what's called a worm gear that is in the mount, and the worm gear rotates at the same speed as Earth's rotation. And the worm gear drives this RA axis. So if you have the clutch tightened down, you're going to have teeth in the RA axis that are engaged to the worm gear that drive this rotation in this direction. And so if you have your camera east heavy, that is the proper weight distribution. So you want your camera to be you want the weight to be on the east side of your mount. That way, the teeth of your RA gear are constantly engaged with the worm gear. If you are west heavy, the teeth won't be engaged, and what'll happen is those teeth will backlash. And so as the worm gear drives it, the camera will shift forward, the teeth will become unengaged, the camera will slap back a little bit, and you're tracking, you might see like zigzags in your stars, and that's indicative of worm gear backlash. So keep the mount slightly east heavy. I try not to go too crazy. So like if you're over here, it's going to be really hard to get a good landscape or whatever. I usually keep it just slightly off vertical like that.